Right, well, welcome everybody after lunch. This is the session on making media work for workers. My name is Des Freedman. I'm one of the founding members of the Media Reform Coalition. I teach at Goldsmiths. And I'm not biased, but this is obviously the most important theme by a long way, because it's not just about media representations or lack of representations or distorted representations of labour and work. But if we're going to talk about media reform, then absolutely at the heart of it, it has to be media workers themselves. So we're going to try and consider all these different issues on the panel, hearing from professional voices, hearing about how the latest technologies are impacting on the lives of media workers, as well as how media workers are represented. But I just think we need to bear in mind there is no media reform without the people who are producing, as well as democratising media production, making sure that media producers have a direct voice. So there should be lots for us to discuss. We're small enough to keep it nice and informal, so please do think you are part of the discussion. We'll probably have half an hour of introductory talk, so half an hour for your questions and contributions at the end. There are 3 speakers. There were going to be 4, but Deepa Driver unfortunately has had a bereavement, so she has had to fly off to India, so she sends her apologies. But 3 amazing speakers remain. So first off, we have Shelly Aquith, who, as she says, does health and safety for the TUC. I imagine she does a lot more than that, and is a PhD student at Leeds University, looking at, and this is the representation of unions, isn't it?
Yeah.
I know we are gutted that she's not doing it at Goldsmiths, but you can't have everything. So Shelly is going to kick us off. Thank you, Shelly.
Sure. Thanks, Des. Hi, everyone. So I'm Shelly. I'm a PhD student at Leeds. And my research project is looking at how newspapers in Britain report on strikes, how striking workers relate to the reports about their strikes, and how unions' media strategies are responding. And I've been working with unions for the last 10 years, and it's kind of that experience which has motivated the research, seeing the whole range of industrial disputes and how little attention they were getting, not just in the media, but also in the wider kind of left and the movement. Now, obviously that's changed this year with the national strikes that have taken and are taking place. There's been far more coverage of trade union activity than we've seen in decades. But that doesn't mean the stories are necessarily told from the point of view of the worker, or that they're even necessarily about the dispute itself in many cases. And while unions remain Britain's biggest democratic membership organisations, their absence from regular print and broadcast media had become kind of totally normalised. So I'm interested in what is going on, what we as trade unionists kind of wanting to propel a pro-worker story to the masses might be able to do about it. And as part of my research, I'm speaking to 3 main groups to try and understand their perspective. Firstly, the trade unionists who are on strike. Secondly, the journalists who are covering strikes, or think they are. And finally, trade union press officers. I'm only in my first year of the research and I'm doing it part-time, so I have many more questions than kind of answers. But I wanted to share some early thoughts, and I'm very, very keen to hear what other people think about all of this. So the background to this is the fact that part of the background to this anyway, is the fact that specialised industrial reporting in Britain is now almost non-existent. There used to be more than 100 specific industrial correspondents hired by all the major newspapers and some TV news stations as well. But since the late 80s, following the defeat of the miners' strike, their number started to dwindle, and now, aside from the Morning Star, there's only 1 industrial correspondent remaining at a major daily news platform at the Associated Press. And instead what we saw was media organisations hiring business and consumer correspondents, and stories from the boardrooms of the Square Mile and the City replacing stories from the trade union conferences or the factory floors. And business leaders and economists replaced worker representatives as the kind of talking heads on the media by and large. Until, of course, Mick Lynch became the talking head this year, a kind of overnight media sensation. I think partly because he is this kind of no-nonsense, really effective communicator, but I think also because it was such a novelty to have somebody who's actually a representative of working people on our screens. And I think the RMT makes a really interesting case study when we think about how and why unions do or don't get reported on. Their strategy in this dispute, anyway, has been to deliberately go to broadcast media first, get clips on TV that can cascade then through social media, and then when newspapers ask for comment, tell them, well, see what's been said on the telly, which apparently journalists really don't like. And it's a strategy partly to avoid misreporting and misquoting, but it's also to really effectively raise the profile of the union leadership and therefore the dispute and the union's arguments around it. Coming back to the newspaper press though, and I mentioned the consumer correspondents, the business correspondents, and it's either those as well as your political correspondents that are expected to cover trade union news stories, which means we're usually given stories about unions that do either one of two things. Either they're about or they relate to some kind of argument inside the Labour Party, or they provide a kind of consumer interest story. So they report to us, the consumers of news, as also consumers of postal services, transport, education, even healthcare. They don't tend to report to us as also working people with an interest in how industrial disputes might relate to our own working conditions and living conditions. And so stories about the rail strike, for example, are reported on from the perspective of can people get to work or not, rather than what the staffing cuts might mean to our safety. Or when UCU members walk out, we get stories about how students are missing lectures that they've paid good money for, rather than what the assault on pensions might mean for the future of university education, full stop. So the more inconvenience that is caused, the more likely it is to get covered, maybe. Take the CWU strike, 100,000 postal workers walking out, but striking posties that I spoke to felt they didn't get the same kind of coverage as other strikes with a similar number of workers in dispute, because people can now just go to Hermes or DPD or another service provider. There's no such comparison for kids who are missing a day of school or patients missing a hospital appointment. So the more disruption that can be caused, perhaps in theory, the more media will pay attention. It's not necessarily always the case. This is partly a product of that reorientation of the media, the loss of industrial specialisms, and I'm told that union membership inside journalism itself has fallen significantly, which could tell us that many journalists may be less aware of what unions are, or what they do, or less sympathetic by virtue of not being a union member themselves. This also likely speaks to the class makeup of journalism, I think, which has changed over a similar period. Many more journalists nowadays are more likely to have been privately educated, for example, which could make us ask, is a media that is unrepresentative itself of working class people able to report on us adequately? But there are also questions for unions as well in terms of how we engage the press. Some unions don't allow their members to speak directly to journalists to provide that story of why they're striking. And I hear two different reasons for this. Firstly, union press officers say it's about protecting members from victimisation by their employer, or perhaps maybe from a difficult interview that they might not be prepared for. But some union activists say it's about protecting a line. The union bureaucracy can be too scared to put the rank and file in front of a journalist for fear that they might not stick to the script. And both of these things could, of course, be true. And as the number of industrial correspondents fell, the number of trade unions recruiting press officers and media officers rose sharply to kind of counter that effect. And I hear from some strikers that their approach can be stifling as much as it can also be really effective. But overwhelmingly, journalists say they would like to have more opportunity to speak directly to strikers and hear their personal stories. And that strikes are more likely to be covered or covered again if they're also given something new with it, so a survey, a case study, a stunt perhaps. So there's an opportunity for unions to give the media slightly different voices from your general secretaries, your regional officers in a press release or an interview. And I think the Royal College of Nursing have done this very effectively recently. They had several newspapers featuring nurses talking about their struggle to make ends meet, their stress on the job, days after just castigating them for supposedly forcing cancer patients to miss treatments. Thinking about who else gets airtime in the media, and one point that I found quite interesting that was made to me by a union press officer is the idea that the space that might have once been given to representatives of workers in the media has been filled to some extent by a group of left-wing media commentators who don't represent anyone other than themselves, but they have no kind of democratic mandate or attachment to the labour movement, but they can be viewed by the press as ticking that box as the lefty talking head. And that doesn't necessarily adequately lend voice to working people or give counter to the voice of the employer, which is often also the government. There is a bigger question coming through, though, as I'm kind of starting in this research, which is, do unions need the media? And there's an argument that, first and foremost, in a dispute, unions need to speak to and win over their members, not the general public. There are some unions who are really effective at this, and I think it's demonstrated through the density of ballots and the discipline of certain strikes. And some would argue that's more important to win an industrial struggle than some kind of PR fanfare, and that the two are not necessarily as linked as one might think. You need more support from your members than you do from the public, perhaps, to win. And speaking to different groups of strikers, you also run the risk of some of the nastier right-wing reporting really getting to activists, really affecting them, really putting them off staying out on strike because of the way that their strike's being reported on, if there isn't already that really strong sense of attachment to the union and what it's trying to do. It's obviously not one or the other, but there is a decision I think unions have to make about the emphasis. So just a summary of some of the things to think about, I think, for unions looking to get more media coverage based on taste of what strikers, journalists and press officers are saying. 5 quick reflections. Diversity in the media, number 1. Do we want to see future generations of working class trade unionist journalists? And if so, how do we get them? Or even, are we seeking to reverse that decline in industrial reporters? 2, whether or how we give voice to rank and file activists in the media. Their human interest stories are relatable and journalists say they want to hear from them. 3, and related to that, do unions need to be negotiating away these contractual clauses that employers impose on workers that stop them from engaging with the press? 4, don't consider positive media coverage or media coverage full stop as such an important factor. The success of a dispute also relies heavily on the union's internal communication to and with its own membership. And 5, finally, if you want more attention, maybe simply cause more disruption. And maybe today we can learn a little from France in that regard.
Thank you, Shelley. That is absolutely brilliant. Speaking as a UCU member engaged in quite a complex dispute at the moment, point 4 could not be more. I mean, I've got so many questions, but and you're in your first year of a PhD. Wow. Okay. Right, move on. We're delighted to welcome Cate Hopkins, who is also a PhD student at Cardiff University. She works with the Data Justice Lab. If you don't know them, please get to know them. Check out all their publications, Data Justice Lab. They've got a huge amount of very public-facing and very accessible reports. And you're investigating the impact of surveillance technologies on workplaces, aren't you?
Yes, that's correct.
I'm glad I got that right. Thank you so much for coming. Over to you, Cate.
Oh no, thank you for having me. And yeah, thank you for coming. It's really nice to see you. So maybe just to start off by explaining exactly what we mean when we talk about data justice. Obviously, we're all here because we are very aware that we're living through this fantastic age of digitisation where we have sort of, a world of information right at our fingertips. And obviously, with all of that digital technology comes data collection. And hopefully, we're all fairly aware of this and kind of how our sort of journey through the digital world encounters a lot of points in which our personal information is being collected and stored and often monetized. So the concept of data justice is looking at how that datafication, how that digitization is impacting on social justice. And of course there are loads of really fantastic pieces of work coming out of the Data Justice Lab, of which I occupy like the tiniest minuscule corner. And I look at how this process of datafication impacts on trade unionists in the workplace and shapes the way that they can campaign and the way that they can organise. There's been quite a lot of work in this area, particularly looking at sort of platform workers, so looking at the way that algorithms impact the way people work with all kinds of platforms, Uber, Deliveroo, all of these kind of things. And I see we've got a Utah here who will probably be able to tell you a lot more about that than I ever could. My work looks at public sector trade unionists and how workplace surveillance is impacting on the way that they can operate and the way that they can campaign and organise. And I think sometimes there is a bit of an assumption, perhaps, that the things that are happening in the private sector are sort of different to public sector. You know, I feel like there's a tradition, perhaps, of the sort of public sector employment, perhaps, being free from some of the more sort of unscrupulous activities that take place in the private sector, certainly historically. And I hate to disabuse that, but I'm just about to. Because from a lot of my research, what I'm finding is that these sort of minuscule points in which people's behaviour and their actions can be sort of noted and stored and aggregated and built into some sort of profile are having a sort of impact on the way that trade unionists, first of all, conduct themselves when they're in the workplace. So when people are talking about technology, first of all, they're talking the language of neoliberalism, right? Technology, and we're all here to sort of talk about it critically and sort of joyously, but it is a neoliberal pursuit, right? Which is kind of in direct sort of opposition to a lot of the trade union principles, right? It means trade unionists cannot speak in their own language. When we're talking about these things, we have to speak in the language of neoliberalism. It's hard to marry up ideas such as solidarity and collective action in a neoliberal space, right? So there's kind of that going on. There is also sort of impact on the way that trade unionists actually sort of behave when they're in the workplace. So the idea that you are constantly under some sort of scrutiny means that you cannot necessarily go about your organising activities, especially if you are living or working even in a hostile working place. So one of my participants described it to me as being at the mercy of the business, and I think that's just like the most perfect way to describe the impact that surveillance is having on trade unionists, is the fact that if they are operating within a space where the employer is fairly benign, fairly open to trade union presence in the workplace, then those activists are able to kind of go about their daily business. If they're not so blessed and they are working in a much more hostile sort of working space, then they have the tools, the employer has the tools at hand to make the lives of those trade unionists very, very difficult. And one of the key things that has come out of my research that I'm just trying to kind of work my way through at the moment is the fact that this is an intersectional issue as well. So a lot of the people that I spoke to who said, yes, my employer has these tools to sort of watch me and to monitor me, but I don't find that it has that much problem with it. It doesn't impact that much on my either work life or my trade union activities. They tended to be people in secure employment. They tended to be people in middle management. They tended to be white and male, sorry, everyone. But that was the kind of the tendency, which isn't a massive surprise, I think, to anyone who is aware of the sort of issues around that intersectional feminism kind of addresses. People who tended to have more a tougher relationship with their sort of employer and came under more scrutiny were people who were precariously employed, were people who came from a migrant background, were people who were working class, and were people who perhaps didn't finish school, for example. All of these kind of deeply intersectional issues had an impact on their ability to navigate the trade union space and to bring these issues to their employer in the way that the trade union is meant to do. And This, to me, sort of speaks to a huge problem in building solidarity around these issues. Because, say, for example, if you are a worker in a call centre, and you are sat at your computer with your phone, and there's maybe a line of you, just like here perhaps, you're all in your own individual work zones. Your interaction with that computer is, and sort of its ability to monitor you, is kind of related to your own personal identity. So if you are sort of maybe a naturalised British citizen, for example, if perhaps you are white, if perhaps you have a degree education, then your interaction with that computer and therefore your employer might be a lot more secure than the person sat right next to you, who perhaps didn't finish school, who perhaps comes from a migrant background or perhaps isn't here on a permanent visa basis. Their interactions with those computer is a lot more sort of insecure and a lot more precarious. What that means and how that differs from previous forms of organising around things like pensions, around things like terms and conditions, is that they are not universally shared within one particular space. If there's a health and safety issue in this room, it is an issue for every single one of us, right? You know, if these stairs aren't safe, then they're a risk to all of us. But if that risk is more linked to your own personal identity, if you are afraid of looking as if you are not working hard enough because your work visa is tied to your employment, but the person sat next to you is permanently employed and a naturalised British citizen who doesn't have to worry about these things, then there's a divide, and it's very, very difficult to build solidarity around those issues. And very, very difficult to reach that critical mass needed to build a campaign. So those are some of the sort of issues that I'm kind of wrestling with, that I'm just sort of trying to write my way through at the moment. And in contrary to academic opinion, in academic sort of tradition, I think I'm probably going to leave it there at under time, because I think I obviously have lots more to say and would love to answer questions, but I feel like that's enough for now, right?
It is just about acceptable to do that. Now you're going to have a lot of questions, not least about how what you're arguing may or may not apply to journalists, for example. You know, the kind of surveillance, well, what the algorithm as a mode of surveillance is doing to the activity of journalism. Which takes us very neatly to my friend Samuel Toledano, who has flown over all the way from the Canary Islands to be with us today. I'm not exaggerating, this is true. Yes. He teaches at the University of Laguna, but he's a journalist and he's on the executive committee of the Spanish Federation of Journalist Unions. Isn't that right? Yes, I think I've got you right. And is a very long-time supporter of the Media Reform Coalition. So, Samuel, you're very welcome.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here, and to the Media Reform Coalition for this invitation. This is a very, very interesting initiative. And obviously, as a member of a journalist union, we are going to face more challenge. We are going to face more difficulties in order to get attention from media. Obviously, if every single union, they are going to face these problems, these difficulties, when we are saying that media, they are not behaving okay, they are not paying good salaries, and all the professional and working conditions are so bad, obviously we are not going to get attention from media. The only thing that we may get some kind of attention from media is when we focus to the political system, things related with the law, for example, in Spanish, the security law related with demonstrations, some kind of obstacles that they passed in a couple of years ago about the way that, for example, if you're allowed to take pictures in a demonstration, many media, they cover that, because obviously some media, it's something that they play this kind of political game. So we know that in certain issues we are going to get some kind of media attention, but obviously as long as we are going to criticize and we are going to tackle and to point or we want to catch the attention about the working conditions, we are not going to get any attention at all, beyond obviously independent media and some journalists and some let's say left-wing commentators on TV that at some point they are going to cover, and they are going to provide a little bit of room. Some of the things that are quite interesting about this already mentioned Shelly and Cate, and some of these ideas are relevant, and we have to understand that at the end we are talking about journalists, whether it's a member of the union or whether in his condition of someone who is going to cover all the information related with the strikes, but also all information related with our manifestos and programs or proposals in order to improve the media system, in this case in Spain, but also related with Europe, because at the end several laws are related with or came from Brussels, and something related with Slavs, and obviously something related with leaks and protecting sources and things like that. That, for example, they have to pass in the Spanish law. But there are two concepts that I would like to at least to highlight: the concept of worker and the concept of loyalty. So from my point of view, and obviously this is a personal point of view, journalists are no longer workers. They feel more professional than workers. And obviously there is something behind this idea. We have to understand the background of the journalists, at least in Spain mainly, and it's middle class people with middle class studies. And most of them, at the end, they go to the university. It's not mandatory to study a degree in Spain in order to be journalists, but we understand that at some point they came from the university. We have, obviously, that there's a kind of middle or at least upper middle class condition, and that means, obviously, that, for example, they have to pay a degree. But it's something quite interesting that I want to highlight. In Spain, we have more or less about 40, let me tell you how many. So we have 66 grades, BA of journalism, but we have nearly 100 master's degree programs. And this is something that is quite interesting to highlight, because the thing is, all corporate media in Spain, what they are doing, big media especially, what they are doing is hiring people through this kind of agreement they have with university. That means that we don't have, obviously we have a lot of masters ruled by the university, but many of them are like made with the university and El País, El Mundo, big media. What does it mean? That all the people, all the future journalists who are going to work in this media came from these master programs that are very expensive, by the way. So what is going on here? In fact, what they say, mainly they say that they don't want journalist students to do this master. They want history students, chemistry, or whatever thing, because at the end you are going to learn a lot of things from your field, but then I'm going to teach you how to write, and that's it. That's the master, the role that they have. Obviously that's not true, because at the end they are going to teach you the journalists that they do understand. They're going to teach you their journalism, not the journalists that you are supposed to study in the degree. So these are the people, and in fact what they say is, okay, you are going to pay a lot of money in order to get in our master, but look, we are going to guarantee you 1 year practice with money, obviously the money that you already paid before, but that's the people who are going to get into the industry, people that at some point came from middle class mainly, obviously, and then we see people that they have money in order to pay the master, or maybe they can do an effort, and we know that they are going to get into the master as an investment in order to be there. So they came from there, and the thing is, these are the people who are studying, and these are mainly all the journalists who are going to work in the big corporate media. We have also this kind of element that I also wanted to highlight, how they think, that they feel, or at least they understand who they are. They have the feeling, or at least most of, and the people who are working as journalists, that it's a profession with a lot of kind of glamour. This is something that has been studied for many years, but the thing is, you are going to have relationships with, or you are going to talk about politicians, and you are going to interview them, a lot of many fashion or sport or in whatever industry, many influencers, whatever, and you are going to have an interview with a football player. So at the end, you are the people you are going to work with. It's not especially the people in your newsroom. It's more or less the people that you are going to meet. You are going to have access to very important people. And at the end, this is the people that at some point you feel like they are in your circle, but it's not true. As long as you just have a look to your salary, you are going to realize that your salary, the people who you have relations, it's not the people who has the same salary as you. When you are working as a political journalist in a local newspaper in Canary Islands, the average salary is 1,200 euros. So obviously, this is nothing related with the salary, with the people you are going to feel. So you feel part of an elite, part of the glamour of being journalist, and something that is quite interesting, and you forget that you're a worker. And that's something quite relevant when it comes to the other element that I want to highlight, and it's the concept of the loyalty. Obviously, we understand that media, they are part of the neoliberal system, and in fact, they are neoliberal actors, and with the rules that we are all living. What is the main element here? Media obviously are neoliberal actors, but also they have neoliberal values. And when you get to the media, there are something quite interesting that even in public media, we realize that there's no difference with private media. Like, for example, about Spanish public television, we have a study that it's something that it's quite shocking to understand that how the loyalty that the journalist should have for the citizenship or the country or general values turns out to be a loyalty to the supervisor. Not even the media, as the family, okay? You understand that many media, at least they want to present themselves as we are a family. Obviously, it's not true. They are not a family, and that's not the way you treat family. I think so. Well, some, at least local media, they do these kind of things, and okay, we are a family. You are a traitor if you just going to ask for a better pay and things like that. So the thing is, what we found and this is the example of a Spanish public television, is that there's a way that you are going to get the access to the media, and the way that you are going to get the access to the media, in the private we saw that it's mainly by these kind of masters, but with the public television it seems that as long as you haven't done a public exam in order to get access to the public television, since 2010 I think that there's not a public exam in Spain, you hire a lot of private companies which are going to do information. It's something that they are not supposed to do information, it's only entertainment, but in fact they do some kind of information programs. But the thing is, depending on one person, the supervisor, and this is something quite relevant, the role that the supervisor has, because this supervisor, this person has strong power, not only talking about employment conditions, is the person who just pick up the phone and call you, do you want to work with me? They have kind of employment responsibility, but at the meantime, they are your boss. They are the people who are going to say, okay, you have to cover this information, you have to go there, okay, give me that information. So all these people
Samuel,
who are...
finish up.
Yes, so they managed to create a loyalty, and these workers, the people who are in the newspaper, they no longer feel worker, they feel professional, but the loyalty, instead of going to the citizen, is to the supervisor who has employment responsibility, but also editorial responsibilities.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry to cut you off, but you've probably opened up, I hope you have, a can of worms, and there are journalists here, and there are union members here from different unions, so there's plenty to reflect on, from the impact of tech to how labour is represented to the actual ways in which media workers identify themselves as well. So please, over to you for questions and lots of debate.
You said that unions have a political levy and that most of it goes on the Labour Party, which, just to start with, isn't the case. Most unions in Britain aren't affiliated to the Labour Party, and even then their political levy doesn't necessarily, most of it go to the Labour Party. But I think that's an interesting point, because it is a perception that we get that loads of what the Labour movement, unions, do revolves around what the Labour Party says and does. And I think that's partly because of what I was saying about how it tends to be political journalists that report on trade union stories. But a lot of political levy goes on things like just campaigning for public services or the NHS or against the government in general. I think it's a really interesting proposal of unions putting some of that money or whatever money towards a media project. I don't know what kind of appetite there is necessarily for that. Obviously, some unions give money to the Morning Star and Tribune or other kind of smaller projects, but I think if you're going to have something that's going to be really effective and reach a lot of people, you're going to need unions to work together on it, and that's maybe easier said than done. But I think it's a really interesting idea, and it certainly used to work many years ago. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see what other people think. But yeah, I don't necessarily know how you'd knock all their union heads together and get them to get behind it. You could maybe have the TUC sponsor something. Yeah, just my own personal reflections.
Yeah, so to address the question about public service, yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the people that I spoke to working in the public sector, and I spoke to civil servants and local authorities, absolutely had this sort of sense that what they were doing was a public duty. And I think that sort of attitude, coupled with the sort of strong history of unionisation within the public sector in the UK, has kind of led to a sort of reticence to strike over these kind of issues. Sort of not as much as in other areas such as healthcare, for example. Now, believe it or not, I started my working career as a nurse. How I ended up here, not entirely sure, that's a different story, but here I am. And my sort of introduction to union organising was in 2011. So everyone remember the 1st of November strikes was in 2011. I was sort of just starting kind of my union journey just then. And in my personal experience, trying to get nurses and healthcare workers to go out on strike back then was so incredibly difficult. So the fact that it is happening now is just, like, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it, like the actual kind of conditions that people are working in and the things that people have tolerated in the name of this sort of public service and this public duty. So in the local authorities and the civil service, it's not quite as strong as that, but it is still there. And I think one of the things that digital technology has changed, perhaps, is this idea that, a lot of the workers assumed that their employers also had that same sense of duty that they did. And this idea that sort of their union activity could be curtailed, that it could be controlled via the medium of technology, is this sort of slow trickling shockwave that's going through public sector workers at the moment. That's my sense from the kind of interviews that I did. And it's this sort of sudden, this kind of slow realization that the areas in which they are working are perhaps more hostile than they once thought. And that is, I think, something really, really interesting. But sort of going back to sort of an earlier point, the ways and means by which trade unionists can actually take action against this are also curtailed by the surveillance culture in which we live, because a lot of people obviously work with their contracts saying that they're not allowed to bring their employees into disrepute, right? My contract says that. I'm sure loads of people in here, your contracts say that as well. Now, what that actually means in practice tends to be highly subjective, I think. And even though sort of trade union action is just about tolerated in this country at the moment, until the government get their way, then sort of going out into the streets, taking to social media, being a public face, resisting some of these things, takes so much courage and so much sort of solidarity and support from the union movement. It's an incredible thing to do. I think a lot more so than perhaps a lot of people realise.
Samuel, on solidarity, we need some serious cheering up and organising.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's really difficult because obviously the system highlights the power of individual freedom instead of social freedom. So as long as this neoliberal system just want to address this kind of competition system, they want to highlight this kind of competition system, it's going to be difficult. And at some point, it makes sense that there's a kind of competition between freelance journalists that they think, okay, I'm going to publish something. But this is a fake. This is fake because at the end, there's plenty of stories for everyone. The problem is that there's a established agenda, and we already know that we are going to cover the same issues, we are going to go to the same sources, and we are going to use almost the same frames. So what we have here is, if we follow the issue, source, and agenda, at the end, there's no real diversity. There are plenty of topics as long as we just take another frame, take another source, and obviously if we cover another issue. So there's no problem from freelance in order to find a story. The problem is that we understand that we have to follow this because it's the main topic, and we have to change that thing. And obviously the way that we are going to frame is, as you mentioned, it's a lot of clickbait, sensationalism, and so on. So the only solution that I can find is obviously a public regulation in order to try to say how journalism should be. But obviously this is something that big media, they are not going to allow.
That's it. If that's all right to abuse the chair, just a couple of points. One is, for all the problems of competition amongst freelance journalists, we are seeing union recognition battles taking place. In places like the US, which is not the most hospitable labour environment, journalists still, in really difficult conditions, recognise objectively that they are stronger if they can get union recognition. And from those, I mean, you might think it's weird. God, you're fighting for the right to join a union who may not even allow you to join. That's very disturbing to hear. But I think, objectively, the conditions are there, even for journalists, to recognise that they are better off, their employment conditions, their roles as journalists will be improved if they are able to organise collectively. So don't write yourselves off, which is not letting the unions themselves off the hook. I'm quite pessimistic about the idea of a union media, only because it will be a media of the union bureaucracies. We've had these debates before in British history. In the 80s, we came quite close to millions of pounds being invested. And actually, I just think, Shelley was being very polite, but there are real differences between different union bureaucracies, and it wouldn't address the questions that Shelley was trying to raise of rank and file voices coming up. The NUJ have been a long time partner of the Media Reform Coalition, and it's interesting that in the last few years they are not as much on the platform or as visible, because we spent the first 5, 6, 7 years, absolutely, even when there were differences, they were much more modest about making political claims. We could do that. But even that has kind of fragmented. So I would be very interested to hear the answer to Eliz's question.
Yeah, gosh, I mean, the two questions about joining unions leave me really worried that the NUJ is just going to disappear. Like, if you're only a member of BEC2, was it, because you kind of feel like politically you should be, and you're trying to become a member but you can't. And I know BEC2 merged only in recent years with Prospect, didn't it? So I worry that sort of thing's on the cards across media unions. I would be very interested to know what the pattern of membership, particularly in the NUJ, has looked like over the last years, and to Samuel as well, I'd be interested to know what it looks like in Spain if the numbers of journalists in unions has fallen. In terms of NUJ internally, I don't know a massive amount. I've never been a member, I've never been an activist or anything like that. I know they have a relatively small staff team though. And I think they're just in general not as vocal or as visible as other unions, even of their size. They certainly don't engage with the TUC as much as other unions of their size. Having said that, in the last year, there's been a couple of national strikes, obviously the BBC local one, the Reach strike as well. So that, there is obviously capacity there to mobilise some sections of the membership out on strike, but I don't really know what the internal dynamic is like, or even the kind of activist culture or the internal democracy or anything like that. I can try and help if you want, get in touch. If it helps to have somebody from another union reach out, but I'm just quite worried hearing these accounts, really. And as well, you know, the struggle to organise and mobilise freelance journalists. I don't have the answers, and what you were saying at the beginning there about the pattern of how that's kind of taken place since the 80s and is only becoming more and more the norm as the employment structure is really worrying. So I've not got any answers, just more questions, really.
Yeah, I think to me this is a question of the individualisation of the worker, isn't it, against the sort of culture of solidarity in the union movement. And this is about the union movement trying to stay true to its socialist roots in a neoliberal environment, and that is what the kind of challenge is. Obviously it's happening in BEC2, NUJ, it's happening in so many different unions. It's starting to happen in places where this hasn't been a problem, like the public sector, as more sort of precarious contracts come in. UCU obviously is a massive problem as well. So this whole idea of how do we bring together precarious workers, individualised workers, to build solidarity. And it's a massive problem that I think needs to be addressed and needs to be addressed quickly.
Yes, obviously there's we have to understand that union it's not only, or at least this is what we understand, it's not only an organization that provides support for the workers of one company. This is union, at least our union. Obviously, it's also a lobby. It's also an activist group in the way that we are engaged with many social issues, because we understand that the labor conditions are related with the neoliberal issues as well. So we are, for example, involved in other issues that are not strictly the condition in one certain newsroom. So, and I think that it's quite interesting because, for example, plenty of members of our union are retired or unemployed people, because they understand that it's necessary a voice. And it's a voice that obviously they are going to try to raise some ideas that obviously corporate media, they are not going to do. Obviously political parties, they are not going to do. Even left-wing political parties, they don't want to get a bad, let's say, coverage of big corporate media. And it's easy to understand that all these elements we have to understand. And unions, but there are some data that are clear. You mentioned before, in the United States, for example, there are studies in Oregon local newspapers that they have better conditions, the people, the workers who are unionized. We also have a Pew Research Center in the United States say that 1 in 7 journalists are members of a union, but large companies. The problem is with local, small companies that at some point is going to be quite difficult. And the other thing related with the landscape in Spain, I think that obviously there are plenty of, let's say, fields where we can battle. And I think that we have to understand that independent media is strongly relevant and they have to play the role, but we also have to face and to challenge the corporate media, and we have to go to the public sector, but we have to engage in social issues. So because at the end, social issues, talking about health system or education and so on, are strongly related with media. But we don't understand, and this is a problem obviously in the society, we don't understand the right of information as a fundamental right. We all understand health education, but there's still something that most of the people, they understand media and information as a product more than a right. And this is obviously something that we have to work on it and help at some point to change, but obviously with a very wide view and strategy as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, I don't know what you're going to take away from this, not just the gloom, but also, it sounds to me like there's scope for rank and file media workers just to talk together, as well as attempting to join or resuscitate unions. I hope that's one of the lessons. But please, it was a fantastic discussion. Please thank our panellists.